place identified as the location for the poem is Madurai, and that act of identification, as we saw last week, happens indirectly, not by an explicit act of naming, but by naming a king and identifying the city as a king's as something that is owned by a king. There's also the term Kudal, which is another sort of metonym for the city. Those are the two things which tell us that it's in Madurai that the poem is happening. From last week's discussion, I'm just going to take one or two elements as a way of beginning to talk about this idea of Pattana, but I'm going to rely a lot more on the other poem that I gave you to read, A River by A.K. Ramanujan. We'll discuss that poem and get around to talking about the kind of traction that Ramanujan in his work, and more specifically in this poem, allows us as readers. I owe a good bit of the thinking that has gone into this course to the somewhat mixed relationship I have with A.K. Ramanujan. It's part fangirl and admiration and part irritation and a desire to burst into inappropriate laughter and make terrible jokes at other times. It's from that place of these two very different emotions that my reading and when I'm talking of poetry and Patna, I'm seized by those two impulses in unpredictable ways. I'll just say that much for now. The poem we are going to discuss today is a poem that I read with great excitement some 1992 or 93 when I first came across it. It was in some inevitable anthology of Indian poetry, Indian writing in English poetry, or some long unwieldy name like that, by one of the many poets who were publishing anthologies of this kind. There's an anthology by Salim Piradina where Ramanujan's poem turns up. There's another anthology by Vikas, what was his name? I forget now, but he too features Ramanujan's River. And that's when I came across the poem. A couple of years later, I figured out that everyone I knew had already read it because it had apparently been inserted into some syllabus. Either the I think look on the internet for a version of the poem, you will find out to what extent Ramanujan has been murdered by syllabus, because YouTube is full of estimable gentlemen explaining a river in various languages, probably for the benefit of anxious young people who need to pass exams, featuring this blameless poem. Copies of the poem that you find on the internet, you have to sift through carefully because, well, Ramanujan was an extremely fastidious man, and he liked his poems to appear on the page just. And shall we just say, in the day and age of the internet, people don't seem to respect those desires very much. So you're likely to come across horribly mangled versions of the poem, mangled in terms of how they are placed on the page, on the web page. Yeah. I found what seems to be a decent version, better than the one I shared with you last week. So when we are talking about the poem, I will use that version, if you don't mind. All right. Some preliminaries that I needed to share with you. So with a river, the other thing that I'd like to do is point you to a long and complicated and sometimes enjoyable essay that Ramanujan wrote, titled, "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" At one point, everybody was reading it in many years after he had written it. It's a very irritating essay for me to read because of various reasons. One of them being how tantalizingly close he dances of uh, something such as caste tension in South India, right? And then sort of dances away from it. Busy with the with sorting the ideas that he's been focusing on extremely carefully. Um, it's an essay that I see as a poorer version of the poem we are about to read. So if you want to see how he fails with those ideas, with a certain set of ideas, then read the essay. If you want to see him succeed in getting those ideas across, then read the poem. Right? So what are these ideas? We'll talk about that in some time. All right, but let's hear from you. If you've been able to read a river and there's anything you've noticed, yes, please do tell everybody what you've found by looking at the poem. I take a calculated risk as I do this because you could easily end up stealing whatever little thunder I have left, but it's okay. One can take these risks and survive them, I think. So anybody who would like to unmute and start a conversation about things they've noticed in a river? Okay, I can see that Ardra has a hand up. Go ahead, Ardra, unmute and speak. Khatija. So,
am I audible? Hello?
yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Yeah.
I can hear you. I guess everyone can. Go ahead.
Okay. So the thing that first stood out to me in the poem is the use of numbers or of counting things, where he talks about the inches rising, the precise number of cobblestones run over by the water, and then 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, couple of cows, and how he sort of organized this in the last paragraph, where he seems to be putting it in order of importance to him, or how he feels it should be important. But that's obviously just my that's what I think he's doing. I don't know if that's what he's trying to do, but yeah, that was the first thing that stood out to me.
What you think he's doing is quite important. I don't think you need to offer it as a qualification. Right? Ramanujan is a very puzzling poet, right? And he's a puzzling poet because he wants you to collaborate with him. He invites you to collaborate with him. So you must, go ahead and say it without doubting yourself at all, right? So I never thought of it as a sort of counting ritual or a counting, device or a counting focus. Now that you mention it, right, those two things, those two bits of detail connect to each other in some interesting way. Right? Nice thing to have noticed. Thank you. Khatija, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, there are two things, one about the poem and one about how I responded to it. I'll start with the second one first. When he sort of
Okay.
mentions what's clogging the drains, it was shocking to me that plastic towers weren't there.
Mm.
Something very funny happened to me in my head
Ha.
about, oh my God, this is such an old poem, which did not happen with the previous poem. um, and but also the other thing is, I mean, it's not something I noticed. It's so obvious, but it's really what gets to me is the repetition. Right? It's like it keeps coming back to it, and something happens with that last line because it's also about there being no identification in some sense. You know? Like I don't know. I feel like there's something happening with the repetition of those things and the fact that he's talking about identical twins and you can't tell them apart. But I don't know what's happening. But it's bugging me that.
Ha, ha. Okay. I can commiserate and say that I fully understand this feeling. Um, the reason why this poem has stayed with me is because there have been details that have bugged me for days and weeks and months about the poem, right? And I know the feeling. It's a sort of thing that seizes you at odd moments and makes you want to go back and see if this time you'll be successful in putting your finger exactly on what he was trying to do. Um, can be very buggy, yes. The plastic point is well taken. Ramanujan did a lot of traveling among the small towns of India before leaving for the US. Right? He finishes his uh, studies in Mysore, and then the first job he gets as a sort of English lecturer is in Kollam in Kerala, where he hangs about for a year or so, and then quits to go and teach in 1951 in Tyagaraja. Right? And then he quits that as well and travels to other places to teach. And eventually, after he goes to Dharwad at some point, where he meets a young Girish Karnad. Right? So there are lots of little towns on the itinerary. And then at some point, he gets sick of teaching and he decides to go and study linguistics. And so he goes to Baroda and studies linguistics there. And eventually, through that small change in specialization and focus and all that, he goes to the US, right, and begins the work that eventually will make him famous. In 1966, he published The Striders, his first volume of poetry, in which a river figures. Right? So I'm presuming it came out of the 1 year that it sort of began forming then and got written at some point in the 15 years that followed. But uh, I'm just sort of trying to put a timeline into the poem. So if you're looking at the period in which he wrote the poem and the period in which he was actually in Madurai and so on, I guess plastics hadn't quite arrived in which they now seem to occupy our lives. I can remember a time in my childhood when plastics began arriving, right? I think for me, the cutoff point is the late 70s, because till then, Bangalore Diary used to deal with aluminum caps And in winter, the aluminum caps were a great joy because they seemed to collect cream at the top. And if you behaved properly, a parent would give you the aluminum top too.
Am I stuck or is Sir stuck?
Sir is stuck. Just give me 5 minutes.
I think I lost connectivity. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Am I audible? Okay. Oh, right, great. I think the internet went to sleep for a moment. I must have been going on and on. Nice to have a little poke in the ribs saying, get on with it. Yeah, so I was saying that is this moment when they stopped giving us milk in those bottles and moved to plastic sachets. That happened around 1980 or so. So I guess that's the point at which, till then plastics were things that were reused. I can remember lots of things being saved and reused and things like that. So I guess in Ramanujan's youth, plastics turning up would have been extremely unlikely. Nice historical analysis of the stuff clogging the passages under the river. Okay, great. Anything anybody else noticed about the poem? Anything you want to say? Yes, Ardra, go ahead.
So when Khatija was talking about how the twins are unnamed and the woman is unnamed, it's also interesting that the only thing with names are the cows, and even those are very generic names. So yeah.
Okay. There's something that happens with those twins, right? And that's the thing that I found interesting, but less of that. I think I saw Katija's hand go up. Did you want to say something else, Katija?
Yeah, if no one else is putting their hands up.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The poet in the poem is pretty interesting. Because I didn't understand the thing about him being in the city for just that day and that day it was. Okay, look, I didn't understand anything about this poem. Just saying that struck me.
Okay. The poet is interesting to me for one reason, and that reason is that many years later I noticed he was the subject of irony. Right? It didn't strike me at all that I just assumed, and I think lots of people reading the poem assume that he's simply talking about himself in the poem, but there's irony around that poet, whoever he is. Right? And that's the thing that I woke up to some 20 years after reading the poem. So whatever that's worth. Prerna, your hand is up. Do you want to say something? Go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I think it got answered when Khatija said, because suddenly this he appears out of nowhere, and I am very confused by this he. I think maybe I'm not reading fully, but I don't know if it's the poet, who it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? It was very maddening to read. What exactly do blank walls mean? Right? Kind of dead end in themselves. Right? How can walls be blank? What is he talking about, etc.? We'll come back to that detail at some point if I remember. Nagashri, you wanted to say something?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
So I had actually read this poem before, and it was part of my syllabus, so I kind of know what was the expected answer or whatever.
When? Where was it part of the syllabus?
From my 10th
Where was it
standard.
part of the syllabus?
It was the part of the syllabus for 10th standard ICSE. It was around, I think, 2012. That batch was like, it was the last, and I had read this before, and the one thing that I noticed when I read it last week, sort of to refresh my mind, was the sort of irony which is there in the poem. Like, we know the names of the cows that they got, they flowed away with the flood, but at the same time nobody knows about this pregnant woman, and also the villagers who are there. They're sort of, they know the statistics, like, oh, this precise number of steps we have that will be flooded, sort of. And yeah, I think like the repetition which comes is to highlight sort of the fact that, the pregnant woman and like the destruction which is caused, it just becomes a statistic or something, and people are just very indifferent after a certain time. And that is something which I noticed newly when I reread this poem.
Okay. I guess that's also the coldness that Yasmin is talking about, right? That there is this moment of capture of, of a very specific detail of these unborn twins struggling for life, and then it's gone, right? And there's something almost clinical about the way in which this moment of death is captured. Right? It's a good point. Okay, we have a couple of people who want to talk. So let's listen to Amulya first. Prerna's hand is up, so we'll listen to Prerna after Amulya. And I think Sanmita also wants to say something. So we'll listen to everybody, not to Amulya. Go ahead.
But this poem talking about the number of people, cows and babies, and the precision, it might be irrelevant. It vaguely reminds me of Arundhati Roy's writing, and especially with her, with the unsettling feeling that both of these things left us with, and also that it's mainly situated around a river and the kind of poetic prose writing, I suppose. This is totally irrelevant, but that's.
One thing that happens with poetry is that you're making connections because of what you read before, right? So if Arundhati Roy offers you sizing up the poem, it's not to be sneezed at all. I'm no big fan of Arundhati Roy myself, not her fiction at least, but the route you take to a poem is your route, right? And now that you mention it, yes, she does make a big deal.
I don't know what that really means. What I thought meant was probably he's telling that, like how they tell about rain. Sometimes rain, like it can be beautiful but devastating at the same time. Like a water, like river, if it is like under control, like the water is under control or something, then it can be beautiful and poetic and all that. But then when it becomes harsh, it just comes on you. That's what I thought, but I really don't know. So that's what I wanted.
He's possibly offering us that idea in some form that nature in action can be both beautiful and terrible at the same time. It's the sort of paradoxical thing that Ramanujan would take great delight in and pay a lot of attention to. So don't worry about the observation being basic. You can't open poetry up until you're making You have to begin with basic observations. Right? Yeah. I thought I saw Prerna's hand go up. Did you want to say something, Prerna?
It's not an observation, it's just a sort of feeling of confusion that I had. Because on the day that you sent the poem, when I read it, I thought it makes for perfect bait to be in a syllabus. So I could almost visualize a teacher coming and writing 5 themes on the board and some symbols and this and that. But then when I read it again this morning, it's also not even offering that satisfaction somehow of saying, okay, these are the 5 themes, now forget it, just move on. Because
Yeah. Go on, finish the thought.
I feel like something is being held back, like it's not released fully,
Okay.
and you're really digging for that thing. That's how it feels.
Okay. So I want all of you to retain this sense, this sense. Reading a Ramanujan poem is to be left with a kind of nagging feeling that there's something you've missed, or something that is not quite what it looks like on the page, right? This sense of disquiet is something that every one of his poems organizes for us in some form or the other. And the great thing about bringing a poem by him into class is that he'll get under everybody's skin in some very specific way, right? He'll leave you sort of, so we'll read it that way. All right, can all of you see it?
Yes.
Are you able to see my screen? Okay. I'd like you to pay close attention to the shape the poem makes on the page, because with Ramanujan, at least, that is part of the meaning of the poem. He was very obsessed with shapes and how the lines were printed on the page, where they broke, and how the sectioning of the poem happened, and so on. And this is something that people tend to mess with quite often. Probably they don't notice, or they just want to save space or whatever it is. But for me, the first thing that happens when I read the poem, as I look at the name check, right, is that slightly circular construction at the beginning of the poem. When he says, city of temples and poets who sang of cities and temples, right? It's the thing that leaps out and begs for attention. And we'll talk about that. That's one detail I want to talk about. The other detail that I want to talk about are these two beautiful images, right? One where he talks about, we've already talked about the things clogging the water gates, right? For me, that's one example of the sort of detail that Ramanujan loved to caress and hold and polish, etc. But the two images that follow, one is the whetstones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, right? And the dry ones, shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. When I read it the first time, I said to myself, who shaves water buffaloes? What is this man doing? And then some 10 years later, when Google eventually became possible, I found out that shaving water buffaloes is a thing, right? I didn't know that this was done periodically. It's apparently necessary when you're dealing with buffaloes, right? So that one little detail that turns up in the poem, I don't know what feat of observation it came from, but there it is. But those two images I want you to look at. That's classic Ramanujan, sort of ambushing you with an image, but also at the same time giving you the sense that this slightly defunct landscape is nevertheless brimming with life, capturing also at the same time the great attentiveness with which this person who is looking at the river, right, transforms it by the act of looking, right? So all that action is happening in the first two sections of the poem, right? And so all of this is then undercut by that one line that he leaves hanging there. The poet sang only of the floods, right? So what you're seeing is that there is so much poetry in this dereliction, right? In this drying to a trickle, right? Poetry still survives, even though the river has sort of vanished for the moment. To that essay that I was talking about. All right, so first thing first, right? What is happening in the first stanza? A Madurai name check happens. He says, city of temples, and you're already sort of allowing a tourist brochure to take over your mind, right? When that process is undercut, right? He says in Madurai, and there's that long typewriter blank space, right? There's that setting off of the other line, right? I want you to notice that, right? So those two blanks are essentially for you to fill in, I think, with whatever picture of Madurai you have. If you sat drinking, sipping beer and looking at the four Gopurams at some point in life, then maybe that image should come to you. He sort of allows you to insert your own cool image into those spaces and then sort of surfaces with something that he has to offer. And the something that he has to offer is this city of temples and poets, which becomes poets who sang of cities and temples. The first connection I am able to make is to the idea of the itinerant poet, the wandering poet, right? The idea that we met last week, right? The poet from Satyamutram has to leave Satyamutram and go to Madurai looking for patronage, right? And so there is a certain kind of poetry, a certain species of poetry, maybe, or a certain culture of writing, a certain literary culture that becomes the focus the moment he says poets who sang of cities and temples, right? So the cities that are being sung about are the places that these poets wander to, right? Or go to seeking patronage, right? So he sort of takes you back to the Sangam era, to this idea of poets ranging across the countryside, looking for patronage, right? And then offers you another historical moment immediately afterwards, right? So those who went to different places singing public poetry, or the poetry that was known as Puram, right, are probably referred to in that phrase, who sang of cities, right? But if you look at Sangam poetry, there's very little god or temple or deity directly in the poetry, right? Nobody sings of deities in temples in Sangam poetry, both in Agam and Puram. They're there. They're referred to. They make appearances now and then as objects of worship, right? So to my mind, the third line is fascinating because it encompasses two periods of composition, two different styles of writing. One, the public poetry tradition of the Sangam period, and the second being the Bhakti tradition, a much later tradition, where poets traveled from temple to temple, right, offering worship through poetry. Right? It was a different kind of patronage they were talking about. They were seeking. It was a patronage from the deity that they worshipped, and thus the approval of the masses who worship those deities, perhaps, right? But if you look at Tamil Bhakti traditions, right, that tradition of wandering from temple to temple, right, is a big thing. There are circuits that poets complete. So a poet like Tirunavukar or a poet like Thiruñana Sambandar, right, would do this journey as an act of faith, right? So there's this line, this third line compresses all of that literary history, right, through these two very laconic phrases, right? What they sang of, the cities they sang of, and the temples that they sang of, right? So Madurai as a place of poetry, Madurai as a place where poetry originated, according to many. That's the myth, the literary myth of in Tamil culture, right? That sort of gets set into the poem, but in words that the poet chooses, right? Not words that are sanctioned, not words that are expected, but words that he chooses. There's one more thing you should not miss when he says who sang of cities. There's a second possibility, and that is this, again, it's a reference back to literary mythology in Tamil Nadu. There is the story of the many Madurais that were lost to flooding from the sea, right? So the current Madurai is apparently the third or the fourth Madurai in a series where previous Madurais were eaten up by the sea. And along with the previous Madurais, the poetry that was produced by previous Sangams is also reputed to have disappeared in those moments of natural destruction, right? So the poets who sing of cities, right, are also poets singing of this memory of loss, right? So the Madurai that he sets up, right, he sets up for us in the first stanza with language that is not particularly poetic, right? But the manner in which the sentence that holds that stanza together is constructed, right, causes us to wander through its maze-like structure, right, darting down alleyways, looking for meaning, looking for ways of making sense of what he's trying to do. So this is the small adventure I had when I looked at that recursive structure and tried to make sense of it, right? The cities and temples being sung about here are not merely Madurai in many poems, right? Which is how I tended to see it when I started reading the poem, right? There's also history compressed in the fashion in which I described it, which I find to be crucial to some of the other things that are happening in the poem. I'll stop here and quickly check for whether I'm making sense. If there's anything you're not clear with, if I'm going too fast, just stop me and ask a question. We'll take that breather and see if anyone has a question about what I've said so far. You're okay? All right. If there are no questions, if people aren't confused by all this detailing, we'll go forward.
Yes, sir. I don't know if you can see this participants giving thumbs up. I think means.
Oh, they did, is it? Okay, okay. I must have missed it. Sorry. All right. Okay, let's move on. So detail number one, it fascinated me the moment I was able to, the moment I noticed it, it took me quite a while to see what is happening there. The first time, the river that he's talking about is the Vaigai, and just as the Satyamutram poet does not name the Madurai in his poem, Ramanujan, for whatever reason, doesn't name the Vaigai he doesn't refer to it by name. Right? It is a river, and it is a river the first time we see it in the poem, and the river after that, or the floods after that, right? And it's interesting to look at this Arya Stark style reference to the river, right? A river, etc. The first time I saw the Vaigai, right, it was a completely different river in the sense that it didn't have any water in it right through the year, right? The inveterate damming and utilization of the waters of the river in multiple dams had made sure that this was just the memory of a river, right? I was told the first time I saw it in childhood that the only times there was water in the river was if there were heavy rains and the dams weren't able to hold the water, which was very rare through the 80s because they were times of drought, or apparently on a certain festival day, they would release water, enough water for people to go and release floats into the river, etc. Right? Apart from that, there was never any water in the river. And I don't remember seeing seeing water in the river apart from photographs of occasions when water was actually released. So Ramanujan is writing the poem at a time when some sort of seasonal variation was still visible in the Vaigai, right? In the present moment, you won't even get to see the phenomena that he's talking about, right? Okay, the second thing that I want you to notice, comes from the ironic moment that I'm talking about, right? There is this modern sensibility that he articulates in the second stanza, this seizing of detail, this drinking up of detail, and then there is this reference to the poets of yore, right? We are told that they only sang of the floods, right? The two things I want to do here, right, is one, contrast the moment of poetry that is not announced as poetry, right? We don't know who is doing this, who is speaking in this stanza. It's set up for us. There is a colon after who sang of cities and temples, right? And that colon is a colon that is there to set the stage for this moment of difference, and therefore this moment of irony also possibly, right? All of this is poetry and all of this has not been written about. That point is made for us once again when he says the poet sang only of the floods, right? So it looks at this point like a kind of dialectic, like a kind of exchange of views or possibly insults even with poets from another time over what constitutes poetry, right? Now, for those who know Tamil culture, this disputation over what really is poetry the use of poetry with poetic language and full respect for the conventions of traditional poetry, or is modernist poetry an equally acceptable form, a way of doing poetry, right? This question has caused feuds, spats, angry arguments, and is today the stuff of a very specific public spectacle known as the Pattimandram. Pattimandrams are public debates where people come and make fun of the opposition and make valid debating points, while the listening public votes with applause and laughter and stuff like that, right? So think of it as a kind of pre-television talk show done intelligently, right? So Ramanujan seems to be visiting that territory in terms of how he juxtaposes two things, right? A modernist ideal of poetry, of finding detail and finding poetry in the details, this poetry of things that I was talking about, right? And this contrast with a more ornate, prior way of doing poetry, right? But very quickly, that sort of debate or distinction goes away because other ironies come flooding into the poem. Okay, so we'll talk about those other ironies after I have done the small bit of drawing attention to verbs in the poem. There are very specific verbs that signpost the idea of poetry as Ramanujan offers it to us. There's first the verb for standard poetry, which is sang, right? It occurs once when he says poets who sang of cities and temples. And once again when he says the poets sang only of the floods, right? So there is the act of singing, the act of doing poetry the way it ought to be done, the traditional way, right? There is that nameless thing which somebody does in the second stanza when you're offered water buffaloes and crocodiles in the same breath, right? And then there is the stuff that the he in the poem does, right? He is there when they had the floods, and there is all this public opinion floating around the flooding, right? So this he is a modernist poet observed in the act of collecting his material, right? Because here he is listening to the people as they talk about their concerns, right? The three village houses are their concern. This one pregnant woman is their concern. The couple of cows, right, comes with a comment, an editorial comment as usual, which is the modernist poet collecting all these details for use, right? And then you have some more verbs that we should pay attention to. The new poets are offered to us with the verb quoted, right? And then there is that contrast between quoted and speaking in verse, right? So there's sang, there's that nameless bit with no verb attached to it. There are the new poets who are quoting the old poets. There is the possibility of speaking in verse, right? We are told that nobody spoke in verse, right? And we are told that this is something that the popular imagination, the public, this large public opinion is sort of passing these stories around, right? And then the he in the poem does something, but that is identified by the word said, right? So put all these verbs together, right? And what you get is a very careful sort of account of the idea of poetry, of the idea of how poetry should be written, of what it should do, right? Of what it seeks to do, of what it can fail to do, right? In seeking to do something, right? It's that which seems to occupy the poet, just going by the way in which he positions these verbs across the sentence. So there is the formal act of composition and the venerable subject of poetry, which is grand things, grand themes, grand institutions, grand presences like cities, right? There is the small scale and the quotidian, the everyday, in contrast with that. And yet, he does not settle the debate in favor of one or the other, right? Instead, what he seems to do is find parallels, right, between one way of doing poetry and another way of doing poetry. So the poets who sang only of the floods are mirrored by this inserted modernist he who was there only for a day and says that, on the basis of that one day, says that the city has water, the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, right? So irony devours both the poets who sing only of the floods and this modernist he who is also singing only of the flood, right? In the sense that they are both people doing the same thing, even as they say, even as at least the modernist says he's doing something different, doing something new, right? So that is Ramanujan's reflection upon this age-old quarrel between the traditionalists and the modernists. That in some sense, the modernists end up repeating what the traditionalists do, perhaps. That in some sense, the modernists, for all that they differ, right, might end up unconsciously repeating some of the things that the traditionalists did. You can pick which specific way of articulating this ironic distinction you like, but that's where he seems to be leading us, right? Even as he's producing all this irony, right, there is also the other thing that he's setting up, and that is this connection between the poet who is not identified, the poet who is described as he. There's a distinction between those two poets as well. The poet who is not identified gives us something that could stand on its own as a poem. The river drying up, right? It has a mood, it has a kind of energy of its own. It is a complete poem in its own right, right? There is that poem, and there is this other poem observed, right? Which is the produced by this he who is there for a day, right? That he who is there for a day is writing in response to something that is in the air, in response to not a private self, but a public articulation that he is sensitive to, right? And so this distinction between poets writing out of the private space and poets responding to a kind of public sort of connection, right? That's another debate, another level of distinction in the poem. And there too, Ramanujan offers us a very ambivalent sort of uh, uh, conclusion, an ambivalent sort of landing, right? So this man is there for a day, right? People are talking about all these things. So there are two accounts. There is public opinion or public narrative, which is offering us the story of three village houses, unconfirmed, one pregnant woman, unconfirmed, and this detail which casts doubt on the previous narratives by telling you that the cows were called Gopi and Brinda as usual, right? So that's the first version that you hear, right? At this point, there are three parties. The people producing these stories or sharing these experiences, whichever way you want to look at it. The he who is there recording it, right? Who's there soaking all this up. And this other unseen but present poet or commentator who sees the he in the poem recording these details, right? Now, that recorder is there in the next stanza. So for me, this person who does not identify himself but is there right through is the interesting person, is the actual poet, right? Because this person has connections with the old poets. He's able to see what they're doing. He doesn't dismiss them entirely, right? He sees what the new poets are doing. He sees what the modernists are repeating, right? And there is this moment of compositionality that he sees. So he says, no one said anything about this. And then that moment is composed for us, right? The pregnant woman drowned with perhaps twins in her. What we are witnessing here is an act of imagination, right? Kicking at blank walls even before birth. So I told you that I was maddened by the phrase blank walls, right? And I continued being maddened about how walls could be blank till I realized that blank walls is essentially the moment of birth for these twins in the sense that they take shape, they appear on the page, right? So it's the blank wall here is the page on which the story is being told. The blank wall is the empty page that is transformed by this description of death, right? So there's an act of imagination and composition, both things happening here, right? So what is this speaker in Ramanujan's poem telling us about poetry? Is he saying that poetry seizes certain anxieties and okay, are you still able to hear me?
Little dim, sir. Yeah, now. Yeah.
Okay, let me just see. I think my connection is up and down a little bit. Let me just try and get it back.
It's fine.
Better?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. Are you still able to see the poem?
It's here, sir.
Great. Okay. So there is a second act of composition, and that is signposted for us when we see him speaking. So he said, right? Now, this said is very interesting because it's in direct contrast with the singing that we've come across, right? We don't know if it's the same thing as the speaking in verse that he identifies in the previous stanza, right? It's the point at which we can begin suspecting that this he is one version of Ramanujan, right? The poet he wants to be is the hidden poet in the poem, and the poet he ends up being is the he that he identifies and makes fun of, right? That's how I've tried to make sense of it. You may not find it convincing. If you don't worry about it. So the he is the poet he ends up becoming, the poet he ends up being by virtue of the poetry he writes. And the other presence in the poem is the poet he would like to be, right? Those are the two people at loggerheads actually in this poem. So the he that he would like to be observes this other poet that he ends up becoming in the last stanza, right? Now I want you to remember that because twins turn up in the poem, right? So those twins are symptomatic of these twins, in my opinion. So when he says the river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, right? What you see him doing is reordering all the impressions and intimations that he has received from simply being in the midst of these people responding to the river. Right? So it's one answer to the question, where does poetry come from? Right? It's one sort of solution to the problem. How does poetry get composed? Right? What the answer seems to be by an act of receptivity to what public narrative offers, right? But also by a kind of reordering of that narrative. So the first narrative that we see has cows named Gopi and Brinda, right? It has a sequence that is random, a 3-1-2 sequence that everybody noticed, right? That 3-1-2 becomes a more orderly 3-2-1, right? A kind of countdown expressed in poetry. So you go from, he also adds something. He says it carries away in the first half hour. That dramatic detail is not there in the original account. It's a much slower process, right? And so that reordering now becomes visible for us. The he is doing that reordering for whatever reason, perhaps to be poetic, perhaps because the other is not poetic in his estimation, right? So that first half hour is very necessary, and that sequence, that neat sequence is necessary. And this pregnant woman expecting identical twins is a reordering as well, because her earlier occurrences, she occurs thrice, this woman who gets killed 3 times in the poem. The first time, she's just this pregnant woman. We don't know anything else about her. The second time, in that unseen person's voice, she is a pregnant woman drowned with perhaps twins in her. Right? So the nature of that mystery has to be revealed by composition. That's all we are told. Right? But the he who speaks in the final stanza has what seems like a new and more detailed version. He says, one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies. And at this point, Ramanujan's capacity for playfulness and laughing at himself takes over, right? Because these identical twins, are their diapers with them in the womb, or are those diapers waiting for them outside, waiting for their arrival outside? Right? That's the moment of fun he's having here with the idea of composition. Right? So right through, the thing that's fascinating him is this business of writing poetry. What happens when you write poetry? Where does poetry come from? How is it different from how poetry was written earlier? Is it all that different? All those basic questions get reorganized into this extremely playful but maddening poem, right? It's the different colored diapers that are the clue to all the things that I've been saying. It's from there that I've gone back and worked out whatever I've been able to work out, right? So the key line in the poem is to tell them apart, right? This telling apart works in terms of old poets, new poets. It works in terms of telling apart the other set of twins in the poem, which is the poet who does not identify himself and the poet who is identified as he, right? Or if you want to psychoanalyze Ramanujan, the poet, he is in private, and the poet, he ends up becoming through public acts of poetry, by publishing poetry, right? He obviously doesn't think very much of that version of himself. There's an unreleased version within himself that seems to have greater integrity and greater, is simply more poetic, right? So there's a certain kind of disappointment, actually, that Ramanujan is offering us when he does this, right? That the poet, he becomes, when he commits himself to publicly shared words, is perhaps disappointing in comparison with the potential for poetry that he holds within himself. with the person he is in private as a poet. Right? So this business of telling them apart, right, is crucial for the reader, is crucial for us to make sense of all the different acts of play that frame the poem. Right? So this is effectively the result of various wrestling matches I have had with the poem. Um, you may see sense in it. You may be too worried about saying you don't see sense in it if you don't, right? Like I said, with Ramanujan, you have to spend many years wrestling with his intentions to understand what is happening. I'm just happy to note that I have plunged you into the poem, and I look forward to receiving telegrams, emails, and other such communications from time to time from you, as and when you make sense of the poem. The last point I want to make is linked to the key idea in the essay that I was talking about. Right? So in that essay, he talks about these ideas of desi and marga, right? Ideas borrowed from music, right? So in music, you have this notion of the marga tradition, which goes all the way back to the Vedas. And then there is the desi tradition, which is local, regional, and is sort of cosmopolitan in a weird way, in the sense that it can take anything and turn it into its own. It does not behave in approved ways. It does not obey rules in terms of what you can eat and what you can't eat. Right? It has a large appetite and it swallows everything that is available. Right? So this idea of the marga and the desi is something that began to get bandied about a lot in the form of phrases such as great tradition and little tradition, while talking about India, while talking about Indian tradition and so on, right? So the idea of the great tradition, they said, is constantly sort of challenged by these many little traditions, by the many desi traditions, which are not really descended from the great tradition. They are local, but they encounter the marga, and when they encounter the marga, they are curious, right? You've got to imagine some Lilliput and Gulliver kind of transaction. They explore the marga, take what they want from it, and go back to their lives. Uh, and the marga takes equally from the desi, right? So the value of this interplay, this interaction between marga and desi, is that it challenges a certain notion of history, of historiography, which says that Indian tradition is one monolithic, unbroken sort of tradition, and instead talks about how the many local things have survived by themselves, right? Have nourished themselves and have also occasionally been in dialogue. Sometimes they've taken, sometimes they've rejected also, right? So it's this complex interaction which we are sort of summoning up with the terms marga and desi, right? Uh, Ramanujan was very fascinated by it, and it's this interplay that he tries to explain in Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? So his point is that it's not one way of thinking, that it's multiple traditions, multiple ways of thinking, right? It's this idea of India as a plurality that he tries to articulate in that essay. I said that he's less successful with it in the essay, and that is for a reason. Please read the essay, and if you're interested, we can talk about it. But it turns up much more dramatically and occupies the poem in a very interesting sense. So that the two people in the poem.
I read it differently, the pauses and where I stopped and where I read the punctuation and things like that. And it reminds me of the structures of South Indian erotic poetry, like padams and javalis. Because the way they are written is that you have the freedom to sort of break it at within a certain limitation, you can break it where you wish to, and that the sort of fun of it comes from repeating the same thing in multiple ways, right? So and also Ramanujan was very interested in Padams and Javalis because he translated some of them from Kannada and Tamil and things like that. And now when this is all I thought of when I read it first, but now when you were speaking, um, even in terms of content, that the Padam or Javali exists within separation, the tension of separation. And once that separation is resolved, there is no poetry anymore.
Okay.
And in the sense that it's like the pinnacle of that poem is reached in that tension of separation, right? And I feel like this also holds exactly that kind of a tension of the separation between this he and what could be possibly Ramanujan himself.
It's an interesting idea. There's the collection you're referring to is one that Ramanujan collaborated on with Schulman, I think. The Kshetraya Padams were translated
Yeah,
under
it's
the
called
title
When God is
God
Customer.
is a Customer. Yeah. I should go back to it. I haven't looked at it in more than 20 years. Thank you for the thought. I'll go back and read those poems again. Right? But I like the connection you're making between the Padams and how they rest on this idea of the tension of separation and the telling of them apart, which is the focus of this poem. Thank you for that nice lead. Nagashri, your hand is up. Would you like to say something?
Yes, as Ardra mentioned, when you said that Ramanujan was influenced by William Carlos Williams, I was suddenly reminded of a poem of his. I think it's called Between Walls, in which he finds beauty in like a broken pieces of green bottle, and then like I could just correlate it with this straw and women's hair, which is sort of clogging these gates, and how he's able to sort of render that in this poem.
This idea of what is thrown away still having a kind of order to it, or being perceived to have a kind of beauty in how it occupies space, etc. Right? I think that's a very interesting connection to make. Right? Uh, the the fact that the person noticing it is this unacknowledged poet makes it all the more sharper. Right? So the unacknowledged poet is the connection for me between this poem and the Satyamutram poem. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I think your observation leads me there now. Right? I should. This Carlos Williams poem that you're referring is vaguely familiar. I have the sense that I've come across it somewhere. I'll try and look for it and read it again. Thank you for the lead once again.
Yeah, I just had one more point
Sure,
which
sure.
I wanted to share.
Sure.
I noticed that in both the Ramanujan and the Satyamuttam poet, they talk about nature, and also in in their poems, in the same poem, they provide sort of a contrasting image. Here we have the dryness, and it's balanced by this whole flooding image, and also in the other poem we have like this calm green, this homely Satyamuttam, and the harsh coldness at Madurai. And also I don't know if I'm like reading into this too deeply, but I was somehow reminded of this topic of like suffering. I think both poems they sort of refer to this whole idea of suffering. here Ramanujan is trying to talk about, people who suffer because of the destruction, and the Satyamuttam poet, he is talking about his internal, like what he went through when he was he was in Madurai. So I just wanted to sort of point that out, like you have this external sort of suffering and this internal suffering.
Okay. This idea of suffering, now that you mention it, right, is the theme that the poets are trying to respond to, right, in a river, right? But the sense that you're left with is that the business of writing sort of takes over, and somewhere there is the question of doing justice to suffering that falls by the wayside, right? So there is a certain sort of ambivalence there about what poetry does, right? About poetry ever being a suitable instrument of justice, right? Ramanujan manages to smuggle that idea into the poem, right? I think the same ambivalence is there in a different way in the Satyamutram poem, right? Because when he talks to the stork and asks it to take this message, right? One of the things that he's offering us is the idea that he's speaking from a place where the idea of compassion, of being listened to with respect, etc., are missing, are not really to be found in action. Right? So they both come from, allied to the idea of suffering, I think, is also this notion of a sense of failure in dealing with suffering, a failure in terms of getting the measure of suffering. Right? So it's interesting to look at what the two poets are both sort of offering us by almost as a kind of afterthought in opening up.
Yeah, like I guess there's this notion that suffering is what leads to art or more creativity. So sort of in that context,
I'm not myself a big fan of the suffering leads to art
yeah, neither
idea,
am I.
only because I'd rather live rather than suffer myself. But yes, there is the fact that you don't escape having to deal with suffering. You don't escape having to take suffering into account, right? That I think both poems definitely offer us. Right. I think Ardra has a hand up. Ardra, are you now able to speak? Let's check it out. I'm still waiting for the
Hello?
second part of your idea. Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. I think I fixed my internet connection.
Yeah.
But the moment you put the poem up on the screen in this format as the poet intended it for it to be, immediately the thing that I was able to make the connection with this is when I was reading the poem earlier, I noticed a kind of rhythm to it, like a kind of cadence in the words, and with this like visual of the like words sort of in this like curved or like arc shape or whatever. I feel it really lends a sense of time which the poem plays with to some extent. For me, looking at the poem right now, when he says the river dries up, bearing the sand ribs, like these lines look like the sand ribs that have been left behind. And another thing which like the spacing, the places where the line breaks are, I feel those are very intentional. and also kind of lend to this like sense of rhythm or timing in the poem. And I think the reason, part of the reason for me that stanza was like confusing is that he plays with time, where he says that there is war. You can only be poetic once a year, and then he talks about how all these things get carried away in the first half an hour, and then he talks about these unborn twins as if they have already been born, and it's a very interesting twisting and imagination of time that comes in that last paragraph. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that there's a certain sort of taking of liberties with time, which I find fascinating. It's also an assertion of some sort of independence for the poet from what you might see as truth. Right. So lots of ideas about poetry are sort of knocking around in the poem. Right. And there is the title itself, a river. Right. So one of the ideas that Ramanujan offers in the essay that I'm talking about is that there's no such thing as a simple unbroken tradition or a simple continuous tradition, that it's a tradition of stops and starts and restarts. Right. I find that idea very beautiful because if you look at the Vaigai, right, the river exists largely in memory and in public history and in things like that, right? So there are those many different forms that the river takes, right, which come together in the poem and embody also different ways of looking at the river. There's the historical river, there is the dried up remains of the river in summer, there is the river in flood, right? And so this, when you say the river Vaigai, which river are you talking about? It's that sort of question is also some inscribed in some playful way into the poem, and that for me becomes a more visible way of talking about tradition as discontinuities rather than continuities as well. Right. So that was one of the other things I mentioned when I meant when I said that Ramanujan is more successful in offering his ideas to us in the poem than he is in the essay. In the essay, it's just a statement. Here, it's something you have to work out. Great. Thank you, everybody, for all these ideas. I'll have to apologize a little bit because wrestling with Ramanujan is never very conclusive, right? You get the sense of having seen a few elusive possibilities, and that's really all you get in terms of resolutions. So the happy idea of clearing up doubts about the poem is unfortunately not one of the pleasures I can guarantee. The best that is possible are a few glimpses, a few glimmers of the sense that he's trying to offer. Right? The idea of poetry and Pattana, like I said when I started, I owe a lot to Ramanujan's own ideas of how traditions interact, how it's possible for two different ways of living to happen side by side, right? And to that idea, the last thing I want to add is that there is the notion of the Nagara, and there is the notion of the Pattana, right? And for me, this poem is valuable because this idea of Pattana is actually something that is expressed in the poem. The people talking, right? The people connecting past and present and producing their own narratives and urban legends and whatever else are the kind of energy that I associate with Pattana, right? The idea